Nobody who doubted me ever saw it coming. Not my father, who told me the farm was a better bet, not the investors who walked away from the first company. Not the men in the industry who had built carriages their whole lives and saw no reason for anything different. None of them saw it coming because I did not tell them it was coming. I built in silence, and the silence was not modesty. It was the sharpest tool I had. I am Henry Ford. Before the cars, before the assembly line, before my name meant anything to anyone outside of a small circle in Detroit, I spent years working in a shed that most of the world did not know existed, not from shame. I had learned something about announced plans that most people never learn until it is too late to undo the damage. Listen to this every day. What I am about to describe is the difference between the person who talks about building and the person who actually builds. When you tell someone what you are building before it exists, two things happen at the same moment, and both of them work against you. The first is external. The person you told now has an opinion. They will express it whether you ask for it or not. Some opinions will feel encouraging, and they will give you a pleasant hour. Most will be skeptical, and they will give you a difficult week. Either way, you are now managing a relationship around your unfinished work. That takes energy. And the energy going into managing the relationship is energy that is not going into the work. Internal damage is quieter and worse. Your brain does not clearly separate the feeling of accomplishing something from the feeling of talking about accomplishing it. When you describe your plan to someone who responds with real enthusiasm, your brain produces a small version of the satisfaction that actually completing the plan would produce. You feel like progress has happened. It has not. You described what you intend to do, and your body consumed part of the reward in advance. The drive that was pointing toward the work has been partially paid out by the telling. And drive that has been partially paid out builds slowly. I discovered this during my years working for Edison. I was full of conviction about the engine project, certain I was pointed the right way, and I made the mistake of describing it to men I respected before anything existed to show them. The conversations were energizing. Several of those men were genuinely encouraging, and for months after, the work in the shed moved slower than it should have. Some part of me had already collected part of the prize. I had borrowed against a completion I had not yet earned. After that period, I stopped describing unfinished work. Not to everyone in every situation, Clara knew exactly what I was working toward, and her steadiness was part of what carried me through the hardest nights. But with everyone else, with acquaintances, with men whose opinion I cared about, with anyone who might have something to say about the plan before it had produced any real evidence, I kept quiet. Here is what that silence gave me that talking never could. The critics never had an opening. You cannot argue someone out of a plan they have not shown you. You cannot plant doubt in a mind that has not invited your assessment. The practical men, the industry men, the ones who would have told me that building an affordable automobile for ordinary people was an impractical dream, all of them had their objections ready. And not one of those objections ever reached me at a stage where it could have changed what I was doing. Because by the time anyone knew what I was after, the work was far enough along that the objections were beside the point. A supplier I worked with in the early years of the company, a man named Gerald who ran a parts operation on the east side of Detroit, once described watching what he called the Ford method. He said he had worked with dozens of men starting new enterprises, and the ones who survived all seemed to share one quality. They were boring in conversation. They never had anything interesting to say about what they were working on. Ask them directly, and they would give a vague answer and change the subject. He thought at first this was secrecy or arrogance. Later, he understood it was discipline. The interesting ones, the men who could tell you in vivid detail exactly what they were creating and why it was going to change everything, almost none of them finished. The boring ones, the ones who deflected and returned to their work, almost all of them did. Gerald's observation is worth sitting with. The most compelling version of any plan exists before the plan has been tested. When the plan is still entirely in your head, it has no flaws you know about yet. It is vivid and complete and exciting. The version of it you describe to someone is the most persuasive version it will ever be, because it has not yet encountered reality, and describing that most persuasive version of the plan feels good. It feels like you are doing something. What you are actually doing is releasing the energy that was supposed to drive the building into the air of the conversation. Play this again tomorrow and tell me if it lands differently. Now, I want to tell you about the period that nearly ended the whole effort, because this is the part I rarely describe and the part that contains the most important lesson. When I was in the development years of what eventually became the Model T, not the early shed years, but the deeper working years when the shape of the thing was becoming real, I made one exception to the silence rule. One person outside my immediate circle who knew the full scope of what I was working toward. A man I had known for years. A colleague I trusted completely. A person whose judgment I had relied on more than once and whose motives I had no reason to doubt. What this man did with the information was not malicious. That is the hard part to explain. He genuinely believed he was helping me. He spent months quietly, carefully, with my best interests in his mind, introducing me to alternative directions, other opportunities, more practical applications, things that would produce faster returns on the effort I had already invested. He arranged meetings. He passed along correspondence. He made the case, in a dozen conversations over a long stretch of time, that the full scope of what I was attempting was more than necessary. That a smaller, more achievable version of the same aim would accomplish most of the same things with far less risk. He was not wrong about the risk. He was not wrong that smaller would be faster. He was not wrong about any single part of the case he made. And the accumulated weight of those months, the slow pressure of a trusted person persistently suggesting that the real ambition was too large, that pressure nearly redirected me, not through dramatic argument, through erosion, through the slow accumulation of reasonable-sounding conversations that, taken one at a time, each made sense, and taken together, were quietly moving the aim. I noticed what was happening only when I sat down one morning and looked at the notes I had made about the work over the previous 6 months, and compared them to the notes from the 6 months before the conversations had begun. The ambition had contracted, the scope had narrowed, not because any evidence had suggested the original aim was wrong, because a trusted person had introduced a sustained campaign of alternative suggestions, and I had not protected it from that drift the way I protected it from open criticism. Open criticism is easy to defend against. You hear it, you examine it, you accept what is valid, and discard what is not. Friendly erosion is harder, because it comes dressed as advice, and it comes from someone who genuinely cares about your outcome. After I recognized what had happened, I had a direct conversation with this man. I told him what I saw when I compared the 2 sets of notes. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said he thought he had been trying to protect me. I told him I did not need protection from my own direction. What I needed was for the people who knew the direction to hold it with me, not shape it. He understood. The friendship survived. The direction returned to its original scope. And within a year or 2 of that conversation, enough of the work had been completed that the alternative directions he had been suggesting were no longer relevant. The lesson is not that you should keep your direction secret from everyone. The lesson is more precise than that. The people who know your direction must be the people who will hold it with the same conviction you hold it with, or say nothing at all. Partial believers, even kind and well-meaning ones, are not neutral. They have a course-modifying effect simply by being present in the conversation. The information about what you are building should only live in minds that are going to strengthen the building, not reshape it. Now let me give you the practical side of this, because the principle without a specific application is something you will agree with and then not use. Here is the first exercise, and it is one you can do today before anything else. Write down the most important thing you are building right now, not the goal, the actual building. The specific work you are doing toward the thing you most want to create. Write it in 2 sentences, as concretely as you can. Now, next to it, write down everyone who currently knows about it. Every person you have told, or who has found out. For each name on the list, answer honestly. Does this person hold my direction with the same strength I hold it, or do they occasionally suggest modifications, alternatives, or scaled-back versions of what I am trying to do? The names that fall into the second category are the ones whose access to the direction needs to be limited going forward. They mean no harm. Because partial conviction in your building is more dangerous than ignorance of it, and you are now aware of that in a way you may not have been before. Build in silence. Let the result be the announcement. The metaphor I want to give you is this: a fire being built in a strong wind does not benefit from more people blowing on it. It needs to be shielded until the flame is large enough to sustain itself against the wind. Every person you tell about the fire before it is self-sustaining is another source of air movement in the vicinity, whether they intend to feed the flame or not. The shielding is the silence. You remove the shield when the fire is large enough to no longer need it. That is not modesty. That is the physics of how building works. There is also a competitive dimension to silence that is worth naming plainly, because the title of this message includes getting rich loud, and I want to explain what that means precisely. You get rich loud at the result, not during the work. The announcement that matters, the one that produces the result you are working toward, is the announcement of a completed thing. Everything before that, the plans, the intentions, the direction you have chosen, the progress you are making, none of that is the announcement that helps you. A completed thing speaks for itself and requires no advocacy. Announcing a plan requires constant advocacy, attracts constant skepticism, and produces no actual result. My competitors in the early automobile years were building very loudly. They were describing their vehicles, their intentions, their advances, their superior approaches at trade gatherings, in correspondence, in newspapers. I read their announcements carefully, and I said very little. What they were accomplishing with their announcements was a kind of advanced positioning. They were staking their claims in the territory of public awareness before they had the product to back the claim. And when the product eventually appeared, it had to live up to the announcement, which some of it did and some of it did not. And the ones that did not had a more difficult recovery because the audience had been promised something specific. When the Model T arrived, it arrived without an extended prior announcement. It arrived as a thing that existed and could be examined. The announcement was the car itself, and the car itself was its own most persuasive argument, without any advocacy required from me. You get rich loud by producing something real and letting the result do all the talking. The result is always more persuasive than the plan. The result has no gaps, no unanswered questions, no room for the skepticism that a described plan invites. The result is simply there, and it either is what it is or it is not. Most of the time, if you have built quietly and without the erosion of premature public opinion, what you produce is considerably better than what you would have produced under the constant exposure of an announced direction. This brings me to the second and final practical piece, and this one is for right now. For the next 30 days, practice what I would call directed silence about your building. Speak about the work only in specific, necessary contexts, with people who are directly involved in the building, with people whose help you need for a specific task, with people you know hold the direction with complete conviction. With everyone else, if the topic comes up, be brief and move on. Not secretive, not dramatic about the silence, just uninterested in discussing it. Change the subject naturally. At the end of 30 days, compare the progress of the work against any 30-day period in the recent past when you were more open about what you were building. Almost everyone who does this honestly finds that the protected period produced more output, more clarity, and more forward movement than the open periods. Not because silence is magical, because the energy that was going into managing people's impressions of the work went into the work instead. The hours that were going into conversations about the plan went into executing it. The mental space that was occupied by other people's opinions became available for your own. Build quietly. Finish loudly. Let the thing you built say everything that needs to be said about you and your direction in a voice far louder and more persuasive than any description you could have offered while the work was still underway. Play this every day until the quiet becomes your natural operating condition. Most people who hear this will nod and go back to talking about what they are working on the next time someone asks. The rare person will protect the building. That rare person is the one you will be hearing about in a few years, wondering how they did it without anyone seeing it coming. Nobody saw it coming. That was never an accident.